Imagine, if you will, a sprawling, untamed land covered with dense, ancient forests. A place where fierce warriors sailed across stormy, unforgiving seas in beautifully crafted wooden ships, with their swords deciding the ultimate fate of rival kingdoms. In this world, the most incredible stories weren't quietly read from a book in a library. They were powerfully projected from the lungs of master poets, echoing deep into the night. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to immerse ourselves in the genesis of a global cultural phenomenon. We're exploring the absolutely critical window between 450 and 1066 AD, the very era that forged Old English literature. To truly understand this era, we have to completely reset our historical clocks. When we think of English literature, our minds usually jump straight to Shakespeare's Globe, or maybe Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But we need to travel much, much further back, over 1,500 years ago. We are stepping into the firelit, wooden mead halls of the ancient Anglo-Saxons. This is a time long before the English language as we know it even existed, a time when heroes battled terrifying monsters in the collective imagination. And courage was prized above absolutely everything else.
Section 1. Britain before English, the Roman era and the power vacuum.
Now, the stage for this massive cultural transformation was actually set in 43 AD. That's when the Romans, under Emperor Claudius, invaded Britain. And for nearly 4 centuries, Roman rule was the primary stabilizing force there. They brought roads, towns, forts, and Latin as the official language of administration. But as history shows us, empires fade. In 410 AD, Roman soldiers withdrew. They had to go defend a crumbling empire much closer to home. And without that Roman protection, a massive power vacuum opened up by the early 5th century. Roman Britain was suddenly left heavily vulnerable to northern tribes and seaborne raiders who were constantly looking for fertile new lands. Section 2. The Anglo-Saxon arrival. A new land, a new language. During the heavy turbulence of the 5th century, 3 distinct Germanic tribes began crossing the rather treacherous North Sea. We're talking about the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Initially, they were just invited as mercenaries to help defend the island, but they very quickly realized the vast potential for conquest. Many decided to stay permanently, carving out their own settlements in fiercely independent kingdoms. They pushed the native Britons westward into what is now Wales and Cornwall and began reshaping the island entirely. In fact, this new territory gradually became known as England, a term that, as you can probably hear, clearly echoes its evolution into the name we know today, England. This invasion fundamentally altered the spoken word. Their language, Old English, is the direct ancestor of modern English. Now, while today's language has obviously evolved and absorbed thousands of external words, the absolute bedrock of our vocabulary was born with these ancient tribes. Just think about these everyday words: house, man, wife, bread, water, earth, strong, night. When you speak these words today, you are quite literally echoing the sounds of 5th century settlements. So this wasn't just a political invasion. It was the dawn of a completely new cultural voice. Section 3. A new society emerges. Warriors, kings, and loyalty. The Anglo-Saxons built a fiercely martial society. Power was held by kings who ruled over fractured kingdoms, and they were entirely reliant on the support of their fiercely loyal warriors. And the beating heart of this warrior society, that was the mead hall. I want you to imagine a massive, roaring fire right in the center of a grand, timber-framed structure. This wasn't just some dining room. This was the absolute epicenter of governance and culture. It was here that kings celebrated their brutal victories, rewarded their loyal warriors with rings and gold, settled bitter disputes, and, perhaps most importantly, listened to the heroic stories that defined exactly who they were. The figures delivering these stories held immense power. They were called the Scops, highly skilled traveling poets. In a society without widespread literacy, the Scop was required to memorize astonishingly complex, heroic epics. These stories definitely weren't meant for silent reading. They were composed in highly rhythmic verse, making them deeply impactful to perform out loud before kings and battle-hardened warriors alike. They celebrated sacrifice, the unyielding nature of fate, and that eternal struggle between good and evil. But oral traditions are intensely fragile, aren't they? Without these specific traveling storytellers passing down the beliefs, ideals, and history generation after generation, the earliest legends of England would have vanished into the mist forever. Section 4. The oral tradition, composed to be heard. Section 5, The Birth of English Literature, from spoken word to written legacy.
So how did these spoken tales actually survive the ravages of time? Well, it happened through a massive cultural shift, the rapid spread of Christianity across England in the late 6th century. With Christianity came monasteries, and with monasteries came the technology of writing. Christian monks, working by candlelight with quill and ink, began to diligently transcribe these ancient pagan oral poems. They captured the spoken rhythms onto parchment, and through this incredible fusion of Anglo-Saxon storytelling and Christian scholarship, a highly fragile oral tradition was finally locked into permanent physical manuscripts.
From that painstaking transcription process emerged the undisputed titan of this era, Beowulf. It is, without a doubt, the crowning masterpiece of the Old English transition. This epic poem, detailing the hero Beowulf's battles with horrifying monsters and a fiery dragon, serves as the ultimate bridge. It perfectly captures the ancient pagan warrior culture of the mead hall, yet it was preserved through the formalized written traditions of Christian monks. It is the defining artifact that connects the spoken legends of the past to the vast global literary tradition of the future.
As we conclude this explainer, I want you to remember that the story of English literature didn't begin with a quill on a desk. It began with a powerful voice in a smoky hall. The period between 450 and 1066 AD laid the foundational stones of the English language and its entire cultural identity. But honestly, this merely scratches the surface. What other secrets lie hidden within the daily lives, the intricate pagan beliefs, and the intense warrior culture that built this legendary literature? The very words we speak today were forged in their mead halls, so how much of their ancient, fierce spirit remains in us today? Keep that in mind as you continue your journey into history. Until next time.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping back into a world veiled in mist, wood smoke, and the clash of iron. We are journeying straight into the harsh, yet fiercely beautiful reality of the Anglo-Saxons, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 11th centuries. It was a civilization built literally on the very edge of survival, a world defined by incredible courage, unwavering loyalty, and the absolute, relentless pursuit of honor.
So that brings us to a rather fundamental question. What kind of society actually produces a hero like Beowulf? I mean, how did a landscape fraught with brutal winters, wild animals, rival kingdoms, and constantly invading armies somehow forge one of history's richest and most enduring literary traditions? Well, to understand the poetry, we really have to understand the people.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the heptarchy. Second, kings and warriors. Third, the mead hall. Fourth, daily survival. Fifth, the faith in transition. And finally, the heroic code.
Part 1. The heptarchy, or the Seven Kingdoms.
You know, when the Anglo-Saxons first settled in Britain, they didn't just form one massive united nation under a single flag. Not at all. Instead, they forged a highly fractured landscape known as the heptarchy, which quite literally means the Seven Kingdoms. These were fiercely independent realms. Each one boasted its own king, its own standing army, its own complex laws, and deeply rooted local traditions. Ambitious rulers were constantly vying for territory and power, leaning heavily on warfare, strategic alliances, and political marriages just to expand their influence.
The 7 dominant realms making up this shifting puzzle were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. For centuries, dominance essentially shifted back and forth, mostly between Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. But as we'll see, it was Wessex that eventually emerged as the strongest power, laying the absolute vital groundwork for what would eventually become a unified England.
Part 2. Kings and Warriors, Loyalty and Honor.
In a world where mortal danger was quite literally ever present, a warrior king stood at the absolute center of society. Yet, crucially, his rule was not guaranteed by some divine right. It depended entirely on his ability to physically protect his people. And his greatest strength? It was never his hoarded wealth. It was his thegs. These were loyal Anglo-Saxon warriors bound to him by an unshakable oath. This bond required absolute mutual loyalty, and it's a relationship celebrated time and time again in Old English poetry as the very bedrock of their society.
It's fascinating because this bond of loyalty was deeply transactional, yet at the same time entirely sacred. The king provided the land, the weapons, the treasure, and the honor. In return, the thanes pledged absolute loyalty, rigorous military service, and, if required, the ultimate sacrifice. Faithfulness to one's lord wasn't just a basic duty, it was the highest possible virtue an individual could possess.
Part 3. The Mead Hall, Heart of the Kingdom.
Amidst a dangerous and incredibly unpredictable natural world, the Mead Hall, which was typically a grand timber construction, stood as a beacon of warmth and civilization. It was the pulsing heart of the kingdom. Inside its firelit walls, kings held lavish feasts, rewarded their warriors, and settled tense disputes. But crucially, it was also home to the Scops. These poets and entertainers recited epic, heroic stories to the strum of a harp. They were the keepers of culture, the ones who immortalized the victories and legends of the tribe.
This understanding completely elevates how we read epic poetry. Take Beowulf, for instance. The Great Hall of Heorot isn't merely a building. It is the ultimate symbol of unity, prosperity, and civilization. The logic was simple. When the Mead Hall was safe, the kingdom was safe. It provided a vital political and cultural sanctuary from the terrifying unknown darkness that lay just outside its heavy wooden doors.
Part 4. Daily Survival, the Anglo-Saxon Village.
Now, we must also shift our focus away from the grand, fire-lit halls of warriors and look at everyday reality. The vast majority of Anglo-Saxons did not live in towering stone castles. They lived in small, tightly knit farming villages made of simple wooden structures with thatched roofs. Their economy was incredibly demanding. Men worked primarily as farmers, cultivating wheat, barley, and oats, or they served as craftsmen and hunters. Women were absolutely essential in managing the households, preparing food, weaving textiles, and raising children. Make no mistake, survival in this harsh climate depended entirely on strict, unwavering community cooperation.
Part 5. Faith in Transition, Paganism to Christianity.
The everyday struggle of the early Anglo-Saxons was deeply intertwined with their worship of Germanic pagan gods. These were deities of war, wisdom, and nature. And at the absolute core of this rugged belief system was Wyrd. Wyrd was a deeply ingrained concept of destiny or fate that governed every single human life, bringing a heavy, almost fatalistic undertone to their culture. In their eyes, you simply could not escape your Wyrd. You could only meet it head-on, with courage.
But a pivotal timeline of cultural evolution begins to take shape right around the turn of the 7th century. Before 597 AD, Germanic paganism ruled the spiritual landscape. However, with the arrival of Christian missionaries in 597, that landscape fractured and shifted dramatically. Following this arrival, monasteries began to emerge across the English countryside, acting as vital centers of learning, education, and the painstaking, beautiful production of illuminated manuscripts.
But here's the crucial thing. The arrival of Christianity didn't just instantly erase the old ways. Instead, Old English literature fascinatingly blends these two worldviews together. It weds the heroic, fate-driven pagan concepts of earthly glory and warfare with the newly introduced Christian morals of humility, divine providence, and judgment. And it's exactly this unique mixture that serves as the defining characteristic of their surviving texts.
Part 6. The Heroic Code, Values Shaping Literature. All of the historical, social, and religious realities we've just explored acted as a kind of cultural forge, hammering out the specific literary values that define the Anglo-Saxon legacy today. We call these the tenets of the heroic code. They include courage in the face of absolute danger, unbreakable loyalty to your king and your companions, generosity from rulers who were often affectionately known as ring givers, honor placed far above personal gain, and above all else, the pursuit of everlasting fame through noble deeds. You see, heroes were immortalized not because they hoarded vast wealth, but because they used their immense strength to protect others.
Even death was considered honorable if it came while defending one's people. This wasn't just a nice poetic sentiment for them. It was a lived, brutal reality. This profound mindset that sacrificing oneself for the collective good is the ultimate triumph over mortality is the very foundation of the literature we study from this era.
And that brings us to the end of this explainer. But before we part ways, I want to leave you with a thought, something to bridge us into the future. How exactly did the peaceful teachings of Christianity transform this fierce warrior culture, ultimately preserving its heroic literature in ink while changing the entire trajectory of the English language forever? Keep that question in the back of your mind as you continue your journey through history. Thank you for exploring this fascinating world with me, and I will see you in the next explainer.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're looking at a truly monumental turning point in history, Christianity and the rise of learning in Anglo-Saxon England. We're going to explore how a profound cultural and spiritual shift essentially sparked an informational revolution, one that forever altered the landscape of human knowledge. You see, the arrival of this new faith on British shores didn't just change religious beliefs, it introduced education, writing, and the meticulous preservation of history itself. But before we get into the details, I want you to consider a rather profound historical mystery. What actually saved Old English literature from disappearing forever? The ancient world was incredibly unforgiving, and the ruthless passage of time has erased countless cultures. The heroic poems and stories of the early Anglo-Saxons were entirely unwritten. So how did these ancient spoken tales survive the centuries to reach us today? Well, the answer lies in understanding a remarkably fragile thread, oral tradition. Before there were libraries, long before there were printed books, knowledge lived exclusively in the minds of the people. When a master Anglo-Saxon storyteller passed away, the stakes were unimaginably high, because without a written record, an entire universe of history, heroism, and cultural memory could vanish permanently with them. Literally, a single generation's silence could mean eternal erasure.
So here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. England before Christianity. 2. The arrival of Christianity. 3. Monasteries and the scriptorium. 4. Preserving Old English literature. And 5. Great scholars of the age. Let's start with part 1. England before Christianity, the pagan Anglo-Saxon world. Imagine transporting yourself to a rugged, mist-shrouded world of deep forests and ancient stone circles, where early Germanic pagan beliefs were entirely intertwined with nature itself. The Anglo-Saxons worshipped gods deeply connected to war, wisdom, and the earth, holding their sacred ceremonies under the open sky rather than under a church roof. And in these early pagan communities, a central concept ruled above all else: word. Word was the Anglo-Saxon pagan belief in an inescapable destiny, a fate that guided every single human life. Because life was viewed as a path already laid out by fate, their culture placed immense value on raw courage, absolute loyalty to one's lord, and facing the inevitable with bravery. It was a rich, deeply meaningful tradition for sure, but it was one entirely built on spoken memory, lacking any written records to preserve its complexities. Which brings us to part 2, the arrival of Christianity, a cultural catalyst. Now, this is the absolute pivot point where the trajectory of British history fundamentally shifts gears. The Anglo-Saxon settlement began around 450 AD, rooted purely in that oral tradition we just talked about. But the crucial anchor point in our history is the year 597 AD. It was then that Christian missionaries first arrived in the Kingdom of Kent. Following this date, we begin to see a gradual yet utterly profound cultural synthesis that would eventually spread across all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. What arrived on these shores wasn't just a new theology, it was the very infrastructure of literacy. They brought writing, organized education, and libraries to a culture that had until then relied solely on the spoken word. And the human element behind this massive shift is absolutely fascinating. Initiated by Pope Gregory the Great, St. Augustine of Canterbury was sent to convert the Anglo-Saxons. But the surprising reality of this mission is that it was simultaneously one of the most ambitious literacy campaigns in history. Through preaching and royal support, as they built their churches, they were quite literally laying the groundwork for widespread reading and writing. Moving on to part 3, monasteries and the scriptorium, the engines of literacy. Stepping out of that rugged pagan wilderness, we find ourselves entering the quiet, meticulously organized, candle-lit world of the Christian scribes. These newly established religious communities quickly became the ultimate centers of medieval education and scholarship. And central to this new intellectual world was the scriptorium. This was a highly specialized room within a monastery strictly dedicated to writing, copying, and preserving manuscripts. This is where monks learned to read and write in both Latin and Old English. The scriptorium wasn't just a room, though. It was the beating heart of an informational revolution. It was a place where history was being saved from oblivion. You have to realize, creating a single manuscript back then was painstakingly intense, highly physical labor. First, there was the preparation of the parchment from animal skins. Second came hand-copying texts with ink using feather quills, where a single slip of the hand could ruin days of work. And third, illuminating the manuscript with those breathtaking decorative initials. A single book could take months, sometimes even years to complete. This absolute, unwavering dedication is profoundly relevant to us today.
Because without this grueling physical effort, our modern understanding of early history simply would not exist. Part 4. Preserving Old English Literature, the Cultural Synthesis.
Now, here is where things get truly interesting. As literacy spread, these Christian monks didn't actually set out to erase the pagan stories of the past. They immortalized them. They took those spoken traditions and carefully, respectfully transitioned them into the written word. And there is absolutely no greater example of this than Beowulf, the oldest English epic. Beowulf is the prime example of a story that existed purely in the spoken oral tradition, passed down around campfires for generations, which finally transitioned into written literature directly through the hands of dedicated Christian scribes. The survival of this epic masterpiece is entirely thanks to the quiet labor happening inside those monasteries.
Crucially, these two seemingly opposite worlds met right there on the page. On one side, we have traditional pagan values, courage, loyalty, and fate, or weird. On the other side, the newly introduced Christian values, faith, mercy, and salvation. Texts like Beowulf impartially reflect a flawless blending of both worldviews. You have pagan heroes undertaking courageous, fateful battles, seamlessly interspersed with Christian ideas and moral reflections. This synthesis created a distinctly new, highly enriched Old English literary culture. Finally, Part 5, Great Scholars of the Age, the Architects of the Literate Age. This newly literate, culturally synthesized society naturally gave rise to some true intellectual titans, figures whose historical impact extended far beyond their own era. We see 4 absolute pillars of this scholarly age. First, the Venerable Bede, often considered the father of English history, who wrote the monumental ecclesiastical history of the English people. Next, King Alfred the Great, a ruler who firmly championed translating complex Latin works into the native Old English. Then we have the poets, Caedmon, who famously composed divine religious poetry, and Cynewulf, who masterfully blended Christian themes with the traditional Anglo-Saxon poetic style. Together, these 4 historical giants transformed England into a powerhouse of literary development.
Looking closer at King Alfred the Great, his educational vision was, frankly, astonishingly modern. He firmly believed that education was not just for the clergy, but was absolutely essential for building a strong kingdom. He argued that knowledge must be accessible, and that by translating works into Old English, you actively empower the people. He recognized brilliantly that native language literacy was the ultimate tool for kingdom building. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this rather sobering thought. Without the monks who preserved these manuscripts, much of Old English literature would have vanished forever. It's a stunning reminder of just how fragile human memory really is. The arrival of Christianity fundamentally reshaped England by capturing the fading echoes of an oral culture and binding them into the permanence of parchment. Which leaves us with a final provocative question. If this is what was miraculously saved, what other global masterpieces across human history were permanently silenced by the loss of oral traditions, simply because no one was there to write them down? It's a question that makes you truly appreciate the sheer power of the written word. And it perfectly sets the stage for our next topic, where we'll explore the fascinating mechanics of the Old English language itself.
Hello and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're embarking on a rather fascinating historical journey to uncover the deeply enigmatic origins of our mother tongue. You see, the English language is this vast, complicated tapestry woven together from centuries of conquest, migration, and cultural collision. But where exactly did it all begin? Let's delve right into the extraordinary story of how modern English was quite literally born. So, think about this for a moment. Could you understand English if it were spoken directly to you 1,000 years ago? You might naturally assume that, with a bit of intense concentration, you could probably pick up the thread of the conversation. Well, surprisingly, the answer is a resounding no. If a 10th century Anglo-Saxon walked up and spoke to us today, we'd hardly recognize a single syllable. Even though we call it Old English, to our modern ears, it rings like an entirely alien tongue.
To truly understand this remarkable transformation, we're going to conduct a sort of archaeological dig into our own speech. Today's agenda covers 1. The birth of Old English. 2. Lost letters and runes. 3. Grammar and everyday words. 4. The sound of alliteration. And finally, 5. The evolution of English.
Let's start with Section 1, the birth of Old English. Old English, which is often interchangeably called Anglo-Saxon, emerged from a rather dramatic migration of northern European tribes. We're talking about the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Now, these groups journeyed across the incredibly perilous North Sea to settle in Britain right around 450 AD. This foundational era of our language endured for roughly 6 centuries, right up until it met a very abrupt and violent cultural crossroads with the Norman conquest in 1066. Linguistically speaking, Old English sits firmly on the Germanic branch of the massive Indo-European family tree. Because of its highly inflected nature, which we'll get into shortly, this early iteration actually resembled modern German or Icelandic far, far more closely than the English that you and I are using right now.
Moving on to Section 2, Lost Letters and Runes.
The earliest Anglo-Saxons didn't use the ABCs we know today. They utilized a completely different writing system known as the Futhorc. These runic characters were composed of harsh, straight lines. And that was by design, because they were specifically engineered to be carved into unforgiving, hard surfaces like stone, wood, and bone. It really wasn't until the gradual spread of Christianity that monks introduced the smoother, flowing curves of the Latin alphabet via quill and parchment.
Yet, even as they adopted Latin letters, Old English stubbornly held on to a few of its own unique symbols to capture distinct sounds. We have the letters thorn and F, both of which brilliantly represented variations of the TH sound. Then there's ash, which is this lovely hybrid vowel sound sitting right between A and E. Actually, here is a fun fact for you. The letter thorn looked quite a bit like a lowercase y. So when you see a sign today reading ye old pub, they aren't actually saying ye. It's literally just the word the written with a misunderstood thorn.
Which brings us to Section 3, Grammar and Everyday Words. Now, modern English is rigidly bound by word order. If you scramble the words in a sentence today, it instantly shatters into complete nonsense. But Old English, it functioned on an entirely different engine. It relied heavily on grammatical endings, which linguists call inflections. Because the very ends of the word shifted to indicate who was doing what to whom, a speaker could shuffle the word order almost at will, and the precise meaning would remain crystal clear.
The architecture of this grammar was mathematically precise. Nouns shape-shifted across 4 specific cases. You had the nominative acting as the subject, the accusative taking the direct object, the genitive denoting possession, and the dative handling the indirect object. Adjectives and verbs danced to this exact same complex rhythm. Now, while this sounds incredibly daunting to a modern student, it imbued the early language with a remarkable engineered precision.
But despite this vast grammatical divide, our core vocabulary has fiercely survived. Take the Old English words hus and brothor. They echo so clearly in our modern words house and brother. Beneath all those complex inflections we just talked about, deeply familiar concepts weathered a turbulent history to anchor our modern reality.
In fact, thousands of the words we utter every single day began their journey over 15 centuries ago. Words like mother, father, water, earth, bread, night, strong, friend, home, and stone. Even after the massive events of 1066 brought an absolute flood of French and Latin into our dictionaries, the most essential, emotional, and foundational words of human existence remain overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon.
Let's look at Section 4, the sound of alliteration. Modern English is somewhat notorious for its confusing, ghostly, silent letters. Think of the K in night or the W in right. Old English, by stark contrast, was fiercely phonetic. Every single letter committed to the page was pronounced aloud exactly as it was written. Silent letters were essentially non-existent back then.
Furthermore, the poetry of the era didn't rely on the polite end rhymes we are so accustomed to today. Old English verse was driven almost entirely by alliteration. That is, the heavy repetition of consonant sounds at the start of crucial words. This forged a deeply powerful percussive rhythm. It was an essential tool for a traveling storyteller, known as a scop, to memorize and perform sprawling epics aloud in loud, smoky mead halls. And the famous epic Beowulf stands as the absolute pinnacle of this poetic tradition. Its verses are a masterclass in the driving, rhythmic heartbeat of the Anglo-Saxon tongue. It's an absolute triumph, carrying the bloody tales of heroes and monsters across the centuries to reach us today.
Finally, Section 5, the evolution of English.
Languages, you see, are living things. They are constantly evolving under the relentless pressure of history. Old English was fundamentally fractured and reshaped by 3 immense forces. First, the Norse-speaking Viking raiders, then Christian missionaries spreading the Latin of the Church, and, crucially, the Norman French invaders of 1066. These brutal cultural collisions stripped away the complex grammar, radically altered the pronunciation, and vastly expanded our vocabulary. So,
From those deeply Germanic roots of the 5th century, these diverse invasions catalyzed the shift into Middle English around the 12th century. This then blossomed into the early modern English of Shakespeare in the 16th century, ultimately arriving at the vast, global modern English we speak today. It looks and sounds entirely different from its ancestor, yet its deepest foundations remain completely unshakable.
Which leaves us with a rather profound final question to ponder. What mysteries and lost sounds still echo within the greatest masterpiece of Old English literature, Beowulf? Old English was so much more than mere communication. It was the absolute bedrock of an entire culture's identity. I truly hope this explainer has sparked a newfound reverence for the ancient roots of our speech and leaves you eager to delve into the legendary tale of Beowulf in our next exploration. Thank you so much for joining me on this scholarly journey today.
Imagine, if you will, a story that has survived for more than 1,000 years. We're talking about a tale of absolutely fearless warriors, terrifying monsters, mighty kings, and a hero whose very name is practically immortal. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're immersing ourselves in the greatest masterpiece of Old English literature, Beowulf. We'll be navigating the origins, the turbulent history, and the profound legacy of the oldest surviving epic poem in the English language. Let's dive straight in, shall we?
1,000. It's a vast and, quite frankly, almost unfathomable expanse of time. But this number represents the sheer weight of history that this poem carries with it. I mean, against all odds, through bloody wars, massive regime changes, the complete rise and fall of empires, this remarkable story has somehow survived for over a millennium. But you might be wondering, how exactly did it reach us?
Part 1. The Artifact Discovery, Surviving the Flames. You see, the survival of this entire epic hung by an incredibly fragile thread. It exists within what we call the Newell Codex. That is the sole surviving manuscript containing Beowulf, painstakingly copied out by hand right around the year 1000 AD. We really have to pause and recognize the immense historical weight of this physical text. Because without the quiet, deeply diligent work of just 2 anonymous Christian scribes all those centuries ago, the entire poem, and the rich civilization it documents, well, it would have been lost to us forever. The actual timeline of its survival is, quite honestly, nothing short of miraculous. Starting from its oral roots somewhere between the 8th and 11th centuries, it was finally committed to physical parchment around 1000 AD. But then, in the year 1731, absolute disaster struck. A totally devastating fire swept through Ashburnham House in London, completely destroying countless priceless historical documents. And Beowulf was caught right in those very flames. The edges of its pages were badly scorched, yes, but miraculously, the text survived. Today, thankfully, it rests in a highly protected preservation room inside the British Library, heavily guarded like the absolute literary treasure that it is.
Which brings us to Section 2. The mystery of authorship.
Now, it's a wonderfully simple question, isn't it? Yet it represents one of literature's greatest, most enduring mysteries. Who actually wrote Beowulf? The truth is, we just don't know. No definitive author has ever been identified. The true identity of this master poet remains entirely lost to the shadows of history. But to understand exactly why the author is anonymous, we really have to look at how this story was originally shared. You know, long before those Christian scribes put their quills to parchment, Beowulf lived entirely within a vibrant, breathing oral tradition. It was memorized and passionately performed by Scops. These were the professional Anglo-Saxon storytellers. Picture it, in the grand, crackling, fire-lit mead halls of ancient kings, this poem wasn't quietly read. It was a loud, shared, intensely communal experience. Moving on to Section 3. What is Beowulf exactly? 3,182. That is the exact number of lines this epic contains. Just to put that into perspective, this immense scale makes Beowulf the longest surviving poem in the absolute entirety of the Old English language. It's a truly monumental achievement of early medieval storytelling. At its very heart, the epic centers on Beowulf himself, a fierce warrior of the Geats, celebrated far and wide for his extraordinary courage, his wisdom, and his sheer unmatched strength. The narrative, as you likely know, follows his legendary, visceral battles against terrifying monsters. Yet these creatures are so much more than mere physical threats, aren't they? They symbolize that ultimate, universal struggle between good and evil, between life and death. The poem just masterfully blends this deep mythological adventure with profound, lasting moral reflection. Section 4. The Historical Setting.
Now, this is a rather fascinating paradox of literature because although Beowulf was physically written down in England, and it absolutely stands as the cornerstone of Old English literature, the actual events of the text don't take place in England at all. Instead, the story transports us entirely across the North Sea to 6th century Scandinavia. And within this harsh setting, a remarkably rich and believable world emerges. We encounter the Danes in present-day Denmark, who shaped the great royal courts and dynasties of the tale. We meet the Geats in southern Sweden, Beowulf's own incredibly fierce warrior tribe. And of course, the Swedes, who are driving complex political rivalries right across the region. The true genius of the poem here is how it brilliantly blends those legendary mythological monsters we talked about with genuine historical peoples. The kings, the dynasties, the entire warrior culture depicted, it all reflects very true, very real aspects of early medieval Northern European society. Section 5. Two Worlds Collide. The text perfectly captures what was a deeply profound cultural transition. In Beowulf, we're presented with the traditional, much older Anglo-Saxon ideals: pagan heroism, strict loyalty, martial honor, and the warrior's ultimate driving pursuit of everlasting fame. Yet, woven seamlessly throughout all of this, the narrator constantly offers reflections on God, on humility, and on divine Christian justice. It's fascinating. Beowulf stands exactly at the meeting point of these two massive civilizational forces, preserving an ancient heroic tradition on one hand, while fully embracing a newly established Christian morality on the other. Which leads us to our final section, Section 6, an enduring literary legacy. Look, the sheer, monumental impact of this epic simply cannot be overstated. Beowulf is nothing less than the very foundation of the English literary tradition. It's studied globally in universities, allowing us a precious window into the hopes, the fears, and the highest ideals of the Anglo-Saxon people. But even well beyond academia, its timeless themes, courage, the burden of leadership, our own mortality, they continually inspire modern fantasy writers and filmmakers today. Actually, the epic, heroic landscapes that we enjoy so much in modern pop culture, they owe a truly massive debt to this single surviving fire-scorched manuscript. Because ultimately, the deepest human values often remain exactly the same. While our languages evolve and entire civilizations completely change over millennia, the human core that was etched into the Knoll Codex really doesn't. Those fundamental themes of courage, of ultimate sacrifice, and the eternal struggle against the darkness, they are just as potent for us now as they were in those firelit mead halls well over 1,000 years ago. Beowulf, then, is so much more than just an ancient poem. It is the resilient, beating voice of a civilization. In our next explainer, we'll be following Beowulf himself as we break down his 3 legendary battles against Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon. But until then, I want to leave you with this final, rather provocative thought. What heroic ideals from the Anglo-Saxon world do you still see reflected in our culture today? Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the very origins of English literature. Picture this. You're standing on the shores of the North Sea, the icy wind howling against the wooden hulls of ancient Viking ships. We're going back over 1,000 years to a story that first echoed through the firelit mead halls of Anglo-Saxon England. In this explainer, we're diving deep into the dark fantasy realism of early medieval Europe to unpack the complete story of Beowulf. It's a timeless epic, a tale of a fearless warrior whose sheer courage made him an absolute legend. We're going to walk through his 3 greatest battles to understand exactly why this ancient hero remains one of the most celebrated figures in world literature. But right off the bat, we've got to ask ourselves, what actually makes a hero legendary? Is it just brute strength, or is it something much deeper? You know, things like bravery, unwavering loyalty, the willingness to sacrifice everything, and ultimately how someone faces the inevitable passage of time. Keep those ideas in the back of your mind as we explore what is, frankly, a profound test of human endurance. Chapter 1. The Monster Grendel. Our story kicks off in the kingdom of the Danes. It's ruled by the highly successful King Hrothgar. To celebrate his people's prosperity, he builds this magnificent mead hall, a monument of joy called Hiorat. Imagine this grand, towering wooden structure glowing with firelight in the pitch black. Inside, warriors are celebrating victories with roaring music, laughter, and massive feasts. But that joyous noise carried far out into the darkness, and it attracted something terrible. A shadowy, terrifying creature creeping out from the fog-covered marshes. His name was Grendel, and Grendel absolutely despised the sounds of joy, so he decided to silence them.
12. That's how many years this nightmare lasted.
For 12 long, agonizing years, Grendel terrorized the Great Hall. Every single night, the monster would burst through Heorot's heavy wooden doors, slaughter the sleeping warriors, and then just vanish back into the swamp before sunrise. And the Danes? They were completely helpless. Well, word of this 12-year reign of terror eventually makes its way across the harsh seas to the land of the Geats. And this is where our protagonist enters the picture. Beowulf is a young warrior among the Geats, and he's already famous. Why? Because he supposedly possesses the strength of 30 men in each hand. Hearing about Hrothgar's desperate situation, Beowulf gathers 14 of his most loyal, fearless companions, and they sail straight for Denmark to face this nightmare head-on.
Now, Beowulf arrives at Heorot with a brilliant and honestly incredibly bold strategy. He knows Grendel fights without weapons. So what does Beowulf do? He strips off his own armor. He chooses to face this monster entirely with his bare hands. No traps, no tricks. He simply lies down in the darkened hall with his men and waits. When Grendel smashes those doors open that night, he's expecting easy prey. Instead, he finds a hero. The battle that follows is absolute chaos. Imagine the deep, thumping rhythm of war drums. The entire hall is shaking. Massive wooden beams are literally cracking under their weight. With just incredible, crushing strength, Beowulf seizes Grendel's arm in a vice-like grip and just refuses to let go. The struggle is so intensely violent that Beowulf literally tears the monster's arm right out of its socket. Mortally wounded and screaming in pain, Grendel flees back into the lonely swamp to die. Chapter 2: Grendel's Mother. So, you'd think that's the end of it, right? But the piece is incredibly short-lived. You see, Grendel's death awakens another threat, a ruthless, intelligent creature totally consumed by grief: his mother. After she attacks the hall in revenge and kills Hrothgar's closest advisor, Beowulf has to hunt her down. This leads him into a chilling, dark fantasy landscape. We're talking about a haunted lake surrounded by jagged, dark cliffs. Without a second thought, Beowulf dives straight into the freezing, deep water. He sinks for hours until he finally reaches this underwater cavern, lit only by an eerie, ghostly blue light. Now, against Grendel, Beowulf relied entirely on bare-handed brute strength. But down here, the stakes are totally different. Brute strength just isn't going to cut it. He's wearing heavy armor, he's wielding a trusted sword, but to his absolute shock as she attacks him, his human-made blade completely fails to pierce her supernatural hide. Suddenly, for the first time, defeat looks terrifyingly possible. Desperate, Beowulf frantically scans the cavern, and then he spots his salvation. Hanging on the wall is a massive, ancient sword, a weapon forged by giants in an era long, long past. Summoning every last ounce of his tremendous strength, Beowulf heaves this gigantic weapon into the air and strikes a fatal blow, finally defeating Grendel's mother. Deep in that cave, he finds Grendel's lifeless body, claims the monster's head as proof, and returns to the surface as the undisputed savior of the Dane. Chapter 3: 50 Years of Peace. Beowulf returns to his homeland an absolute legend, a celebrated hero, and eventually he is crowned king of the Geats. Now think about the number 50. Let the weight of that sink in. For 50 years, King Beowulf governs his people wisely and peacefully. We see the passage of time in the most beautiful way. Villages prosper, the harvests are incredibly plentiful, and that brash young warrior slowly ages into a revered, gray-haired king. But as in all great epics, fate always demands a final toll from its heroes. Chapter 4: The Dragon. Hidden deep beneath an ancient stone hill lies a vast mountain of treasure, and it's being guarded by a powerful, slumbering dragon. But everything changes when a desperate fugitive sneaks into the lair and steals a single golden cup. The dragon's awakening is nothing short of apocalyptic. Absolutely furious, the beast takes to the sky, bathing the entire kingdom in streams of unstoppable fire. Villages, farms, homes, they're all completely consumed. The kingdom is facing complete and utter destruction. Now, Beowulf is an elderly king at this point, but his immense sense of duty, it's completely unbroken. He absolutely refuses to hide or let younger men die in his place. He truly believes it is his ultimate responsibility to protect his people, right up until his very last breath. So he gathers his elite warriors and marches on the dragon's fiery lair. But as this terrifying beast emerges, the sheer terror of the moment is just too much.
Nearly all of his carefully chosen companions drop their weapons and flee straight into the woods. I say nearly all because as the others flee, one singular exception remains: Wiglaf. He's a brave young warrior who point-blank refuses to abandon his king. Together, the old king and the young warrior face the Inferno, and it is a grueling, brutal fight. Beowulf strikes the dragon, but his ancient blade literally shatters against its scales. In the chaos of the fight, the dragon sinks its fangs into Beowulf's neck, delivering a fatal, venomous wound. But Wiglaf doesn't back down. He fiercely strikes the beast's underbelly, which gives the dying Beowulf exactly the opening he needs to draw his dagger and deliver one final crushing blow. The dragon collapses. The beast is dead, but it's a victory won at a terrible, terrible cost. Beowulf's wound is mortal. In his final quiet moments, the dying king asks Wiglaf to bring him some of the dragon's hoard. Looking upon that treasure, Beowulf is satisfied. He knows his kingdom is going to be financially secure, and more importantly, they are safe from the monster. Having fulfilled his duty to his people to the very end, the great king closes his eyes and breathes his last. A hero's true legacy. To honor their fallen king, the Geats construct a magnificent funeral pyre right beside the sea. Once the flames finally settle, they raise a towering burial mound overlooking the coastline, and they build it high, so high that sailors passing by for centuries to come would look up at the cliffs and forever remember the greatest of kings.
So, looking back at all of this, what should we actually take away from these epic encounters? Well, these beasts were never just monsters. They're symbols. Grendel represents pure evil and the kind of chaos that constantly threatens civilization. Grendel's mother, she symbolizes the endless, incredibly destructive cycle of blood feuds and revenge. And that final foe, the dragon, represents greed, human mortality, and the unavoidable consuming passage of time that eventually comes for every single one of us.
Beowulf's battles with these three symbols really show us the complete transformation of a hero. We watch him begin as this fearless, glory-seeking young warrior who relies entirely on his own bare hands. And then we see him evolve. He becomes a deeply wise, highly responsible ruler who willingly lays down his own life for the safety of the people he swore to protect. As the image of this great history fades back into an ancient, weathered manuscript, we're left with a truly powerful thought. A hero's true legacy isn't really about the monsters he defeats, it's about the people he inspires. Over 1,000 years later, Beowulf's legend survives to ask us one final question. When the dragons of our own time awaken, what will our legacy be?
Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when we open the delicate vellum pages of one of history's most fascinating manuscripts, we aren't just looking at old words. Today, we're going to put on our literary scholar hats and really explore how an ancient tale of monsters, misty moors, and heroic battles is, in fact, a profound exploration of human nature, faith, and mortality. We are stepping right into the grand echoing halls of Old English literature, and at the absolute center of it all stands an epic that has captivated audiences for well over a millennium.
So what profound truths actually lie hidden beneath this ancient tale of monsters and men? It's really tempting to just view this 1,000-year-old text as a simple adventure, a primitive action story. But as we're going to see, it serves as a completely timeless reflection of the Anglo-Saxon world. It invites us to uncover the major themes, the intricate poetry, and the deep symbolism that elevate it far beyond a mere survival tale, marking it as a true masterpiece of world literature. Every battle, every formal speech, and every victory carries an immense weight that absolutely still resonates today.
Part 1. True Heroism and Eternal Struggles, Beyond the Sword.
Let's talk about heroism. In Anglo-Saxon society, heroism absolutely wasn't just about swinging a sword or having brutal physical force. Not at all. It was a deeply complex moral code. A true hero was expected to demonstrate profound wisdom, real generosity, and an unwavering, selfless commitment to protecting others. We can see this brilliantly illustrated right in the arc of our protagonist. Think about it. In his youth, he willingly risks his own life to save King Hrothgar's people from the absolute terror of Grendel. It's a purely altruistic act. Decades later, as an aging king himself, he steps up to face a fire-breathing dragon, And crucially, he does this not to win personal glory or to build his own legend, but to safeguard his kingdom from total ruin. From beginning to end, true heroism is measured by selfless service.
And this idea of heroism is starkly defined by a literal, eternal struggle between good and evil. On one side, we have our protagonist representing civilizing moral character, courage, discipline, and order. Against this stands the chaotic, destructive hatred embodied by his monstrous foe, Grendel. The epic is basically telling us that while evil can never be permanently eradicated from the world, it must constantly be met with the unwavering bravery and integrity of good men.
Part 2. The Unescapable Power of Weird. The Appointed Course.
At the very core of this worldview is a fascinating concept, word. This is the Anglo-Saxon concept of fate, or destiny. It basically signifies that every single person's life has a pre-appointed course, a thread woven long before they were born that ultimately cannot be escaped. And what's amazing is how our protagonist embraces his word. He does it with remarkable courage. He steps into the darkest, most terrifying battles without that paralyzing fear of death, simply because he knows that every warrior must eventually meet his preordained destiny. Now, this isn't nihilism. Rather, it's a profound, courageous acceptance of reality.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The epic actually blends two completely distinct worldviews seamlessly together. On one hand, we have the inescapable, predetermined pagan fatalism of weird. On the other hand, we have the Christian narrator's assurance of divine providence, this deep belief that a just and wise God is guiding human events. Blending these philosophies together creates this beautiful intellectual tension that perfectly captures the transitional era in which the poem was composed.
Part 3. Loyalty, Honor, and Leadership. The Bonds of the Mead Hall.
Think of mutual loyalty as the absolute glue of the Dark Age world. It forged this essential bond of trust and unity between a king and his warriors, usually sworn within the warm, safe walls of the mead hall. But words spoken in the warmth of the hall have to be tested in the fire. During the climactic dragon battle at the very end of the epic, seasoned warriors actually flee to the woods in utter terror, abandoning their lord. Only one young warrior, Wiglaf, remains beside his king. That cowardly retreat brilliantly highlights Wiglaf's ultimate loyalty. It proves that true leadership and mutual honor inspire faithful companions to stand firm, even when staring right into the face of death.
Part 4. Decoding the epic symbolism, monsters as metaphors.
To really grasp the genius of this text, we absolutely have to look at the deep psychological weight of its symbolism. These terrifying monsters and desolate landscapes, they represent universal human struggles, not just physical enemies to be slain. Take Grendel. He isn't just a beast, he literally embodies envy, isolation, and hatred. Grendel's mother represents the highly destructive, endless cycle of vengeance and retaliation. And the dragon, fiercely guarding its hoard, symbolizes the ultimate tragedy of greed, pride, and our attachment to wealth in the face of mortality. Standing against all of these horrors is Heorot, the mead hall. This beautiful structure symbolizes the fragile warmth of civilization, community, and joy, which is constantly being threatened by the dark marshes, the chaotic, fear-inducing unknown.
Part 5. Masterpieces of Old English Poetics. The Mechanics of the Epic.
So how exactly did the poet weave this kind of magic without relying on the modern crutch of rhyming? Well, the secret ingredient is alliteration. That's the deliberate repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of important words. Remember, this was an oral tradition. These stories were spoken or sung aloud before a captivated audience, and alliteration acts as the engine of the verse. It drives the rhythm forward like a beating drum, and it places intense, precise emphasis on the vital words, binding the lines of poetry together with just remarkable power.
Now, equally brilliant in their poetic toolkit is the use of kennings. These are highly imaginative compound expressions that step in for ordinary nouns, completely transforming the mundane into the mythic. So instead of simply saying the sea, the poet calls it the whale road. The human body becomes the bone house. It's incredible, right? These terms force the listener to pause and visualize the Anglo-Saxon environment in a much richer, far more vivid light.
All of these brilliant linguistic tools, the alliteration and the kennings, are tightly woven into classic epic conventions. We're talking about a larger-than-life heroic protagonist, terrifying supernatural enemies, grand formal speeches delivered right before combat, long and perilous journeys, and monumental battles that test not just physical strength, but the ultimate courage and moral character of the hero. Together, these conventions provide the poem with a vast, mythic structure that elevates it so far above a simple folktale.
Now, even though we are centuries removed from the mead halls and those dark, misty marshes, this explainer really highlights just how fiercely universal these themes remain today. Every single generation faces its own monsters, right? Its own chaos, greed, and destructive hatred. Every society still desperately requires courageous leaders, and every individual must still confront their own fears, make incredibly difficult moral choices, and ultimately strive to leave behind a meaningful legacy in the face of their own inescapable weird.
Ultimately, we don't just study these ancient words for their immense historical and linguistic value. We read them because they hold a brilliant, unyielding mirror up to our own humanity. Great literature survives because its truths never grow old. It reminds us of the enduring nature of courage, loyalty, and the human spirit across the centuries. So thank you for joining me on this scholarly journey into the absolute heart of Old English literature. Until next time, keep exploring the truths that time simply cannot erase.
Welcome to our explainer. I want you to imagine, just for a moment, stepping out of our loud, frantic modern world and right into a quiet, ancient, candle-lit library. Picture yourself surrounded by heavy parchment scrolls and beautifully illuminated manuscripts. Today, we're setting up a rich, scholarly atmosphere to look far beyond the shadow of a very famous epic, to discover the true, highly diverse masterpieces of Old English literature.
So, is Old English literature just Beowulf? Well, it's an incredibly common misconception. For most of us, when we think of early medieval England, the legendary monster-slaying adventures of Beowulf immediately come to mind. But actually, the literary world of the Anglo-Saxons was far richer, vastly more diverse, and deeply profound. There's an entire world of text that has miraculously survived the centuries, and it's just waiting to be explored.
Here is our map for today's journey. We'll be covering 6 chapters. First, Beyond the Beowulf Legend. Then, Elegies of the Exiled. Third, The Heroic Speaking Cross. Fourth, The Last Stand at Malden. Fifth, The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And finally, A Legacy of Words.
Chapter 1. Beyond the Beowulf Legend, the Anglo-Saxon World.
To truly understand this literature, we first have to understand the complex civilization that literally laid the foundation of the English language. You see, the real Anglo-Saxon world was forged in quiet, freezing monasteries, which were essentially the data centers of their age, and in bustling, smoke-filled royal courts, where the roar of the hearth kept the biting cold at bay. It was a time defined by deep hopes and profound fears. The texts composed in these spaces weren't just thrilling tales meant for entertainment. They were powerful reflections of early medieval England, filled with intense emotional depth and stunning intellectual richness.
Chapter 2. Elegies of the Exiled, the Wanderer, and the Seafarer.
Let's look at a really fascinating parallel between 2 incredible elegies. In The Wanderer, we follow a lonely warrior who has lost everything, his lord, his companions, his homeland, and he wanders through a cold, incredibly uncertain world. Then, in The Seafarer, we meet a solitary sailor battling freezing waves, violent storms, and terrible, crushing isolation. Both of these texts vividly portray intense physical hardship and deep grief. When you read them, you can almost hear the winter wind howling and the heavy waves crashing against a wooden hull.
Now, both of these poems take us on a very distinct 3-step spiritual journey. Step 1 is physical hardship, the biting cold, the hunger, and that total isolation. Step 2 moves into a quiet reflection on fragility, where the speaker comes to the realization that earthly happiness, power, and friendship are entirely temporary. And finally, step 3 brings us to spiritual comfort and faith. These elegies brilliantly transition from literal, earthly suffering into a highly symbolic search for eternal wisdom. Unlike Beowulf's primary focus on heroic action, these works invite a quiet, deeply moving reflection on just how fragile human life really is.
Moving on to Chapter 3. The Heroic Speaking Cross, the Dream of the Rude.
Imagine, if you will, a magnificent, towering cross, and it begins to speak. This striking image introduces us to one of the most extraordinary religious visions of the entire Old English period. In The Dream of the Rude, the narrator experiences this powerful dream where the story of the crucifixion is actually told directly from the perspective of the cross itself.
This perfectly illustrates how early England took brand new ideas and molded them to fit their existing culture. Instead of the traditional Mediterranean view of Christ as solely a passive, suffering figure, the Anglo-Saxon poets presented him as a heroic warrior, boldly and willingly facing death to save humanity. This poem is, quite frankly, an absolute masterclass in blending Christian theology with the deeply ingrained cultural traditions of Anglo-Saxon heroic ideals. It creates something highly original and profoundly powerful.
Chapter 4. The Last Stand at Malden. The Price of Loyalty.
The year is 991 AD. We're leaving the quiet realm of dreams and elegies and stepping right into a bloody, very real historical conflict known as the Battle of Malden. Here, an Anglo-Saxon shield wall desperately defended their homeland against terrifying Viking invaders who had just arrived on the English coast.
Our hero here, Britnoth, chooses absolute courage despite completely overwhelming odds. Now, this isn't just a story, it's a living testament to the absolute core values of Anglo-Saxon society. Even after their leader, Britnoth, falls in battle, many of his warriors steadfastly refuse to abandon the battlefield. They consciously choose unwavering loyalty to their fallen lord over their own survival. It stands today as one of the finest surviving examples of heroic poetry, celebrating honor, sacrifice, and absolute unflinching devotion.
Chapter 5. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Writing the Realm.
Now we're shifting gears from soaring poetry to vital historical prose. Think of it as a continuous, year-by-year record of the realm. In the first year, you might read about bloody battles. The second year, complex royal successions. The third, brutal Viking invasions. In the fourth, a rather inconvenient natural disaster. Compiled across several different monasteries, often by monks working with ink that was literally freezing in their inkwells during the harsh winters, this massive document captures the true, unvarnished sweep of time in early England.
So, why does a dusty old timeline actually matter to us today? Well, these are the earliest continuous historical records saving early English history from disappearing entirely. Without these precise chronicles written down in the English language, much of what we know about the political developments and the gritty daily realities of Anglo-Saxon society would have vanished into the mists of time forever. Modern historians owe an incredible debt to those dedicated monks.
And finally, Chapter 6. A Legacy of Words, the enduring legacy of Old English literature.
If there's one thing our journey today proves, it's the sheer, extraordinary diversity of Old English literature. We've seen The Wanderer, an elegy focused entirely on personal reflection. We've looked at The Dream of the Rood, a visionary text centering on spiritual heroism. And we've explored the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, dedicated to meticulous factual record-keeping. This carefully curated anthology confirms that the literature of this era was never just a single epic monster tale. It was a vibrant, rich collection of brilliantly diverse voices.
But, despite all their differences in genre and style, they share these incredibly universal themes: courage, loyalty, fate, exile, mortality, and that ever-present search for lasting meaning. These ancient writers managed to transform the raw, often brutal struggles of their age into works of lasting artistic and historical value. They captured the human condition in a way that remains incredibly poignant and universally understood by us even centuries later.
The foundation these unknown writers built absolutely paved the way for the future. In our next explainer, we're going to introduce you to the remarkable pioneers who directly shaped the English language. Names like Cædmon, Cynewulf, Bede, and King Alfred the Great. You definitely won't want to miss how these brilliant minds carried the torch forward, deeply influencing both literature and learning for generations to come.
As we gently close our manuscript for today, I want to leave you with this thought. How do these ancient themes of loss, hope, and survival still echo in the literature we read today? Human nature hasn't really changed, and neither has our fundamental need to tell stories that help us survive the storm. So keep exploring, keep reading, and I'll see you in our next explainer.
Okay, I want you to picture an ancient monastery library. The air is cool, and literally the only sound is just the soft scratching of a quill against parchment. You've got candlelight flickering across a heavy wooden desk, lighting up these delicate manuscripts in glass inkpots. Welcome to this explainer, where we're stepping way back into the shadows of the Old English period. We're going to uncover a truly incredible literary heritage, one that honestly laid the very foundation for the words you and I are speaking right now.
And that brings us to a really compelling question. Who actually saved this stuff? Because between 450 and 1066 AD, the survival of literature was incredibly fragile. The language we speak, the stories we tell, the history we record, all of it essentially hung by a thread. Without a few fiercely dedicated individuals working through a seriously turbulent era, much of England's earliest literary heritage would have just vanished forever.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 4 foundational architects of this era:
Cædmon the originator, Cynewulf the artist, Bede the historian, and King Alfred the scholar king. Then we'll wrap up by looking at their enduring legacy.
Let's dive right into Part 1, Cædmon, the first poet.
Our journey starts in the 7th century, out on the dramatic, windswept coastal cliffs of Whitby Abbey. And right away, we hit this massive historical irony. See, Cædmon wasn't some elite scholar. He was an ordinary, completely illiterate cowherd. He spent his days tending cattle in the monastery's fields, absolutely convinced he had zero talent for poetry. But, as the legend goes, he had this profound dream. He was bathed in heavenly light, and a figure commanded him to sing about the creation of the world. He woke up the next morning, and, almost like an ancient overnight rap sensation, he could suddenly compose this incredibly complex, beautiful religious verse. The result of that was Cædmon's hymn, which is a short verse praising God as the creator of heaven and earth. Now, why does this matter so much? Because this brief piece of poetry is considered the literal birth of the English poetic tradition. It is the absolute earliest known English poem where we actually know the author's name. A humble shepherd sparked an entire literary revolution.
Moving on to Part 2, Cynewulf, the mysterious poet.
As we move into the 8th and 9th centuries, we meet a true master of the craft. Now, during a time when almost all Anglo-Saxon writers stayed completely anonymous, Cynewulf boldly broke from that tradition. Historians attribute 4 major surviving works to him: Juliana, Elene, The Fates of the Apostles, and Christ too. His poetry is amazing. It beautifully weaves these deep Christian teachings with the vivid imagery and complex alliteration that you'd expect from traditional Old English verse. But wait, if writers were mostly anonymous back then, how do we actually know these works belong to him? Well, imagine you're turning the pages of an illuminated manuscript, and suddenly, glowing among the text, ancient runic letters reveal a secret. Cynewulf was super clever. He embedded the letters of his own name directly into the text of his poems, using runes. It was essentially an ingenious ancient puzzle. It allowed him to preserve his identity through time and leave this permanent, deeply personal stamp on English literature.
Which brings us to Part 3, Bede, father of history.
If we travel over to the monastery of Jarrow, we find an extraordinarily dedicated monk who was born around 673 AD. This is the Venerable Bede. Unlike the poets we just talked about, Bede devoted his life entirely to intense study. Now, I want you to lock this year into your mind, 731 AD, because this single number marks the completion of a masterwork that would literally change how we understand the past forever.
That masterwork was the ecclesiastical history of the English people. But here's the thing. Bede didn't just write about religion. He meticulously preserved absolutely invaluable information about Anglo-Saxon society, its kings and its culture. His careful, rigorous scholarship earned him the ultimate title, the Father of English History. Even today, modern historians still rely heavily on Bede as one of the most trustworthy sources we have for early medieval England.
Next up is Part 4, Alfred, the Scholar King.
Leaving those quiet monasteries behind, we step into the high-stakes 9th century royal court of Wessex. King Alfred the Great carried an immense, honestly almost impossible dual burden. On one side, he was mounting a desperate military defense, physically dodging Viking longships and fighting grueling, bloody battles. But Alfred understood something crucial. Winning the war meant nothing if they lost their minds. He saw literacy rapidly declining across his kingdom, so he waged a simultaneous cultural defense. Because honestly, dodging Vikings while simultaneously trying to start what was essentially a national book club, that is no small feat. He knew a kingdom that forgets how to read and think is a kingdom that's already lost.
So what was the Scholar King's game plan? He rolled out a brilliant 2-step methodology. Step 1, establish schools to actively revive learning. Step 2, order the translation of highly important Latin works directly into Old English. Think about how radical that was. He was taking exclusive knowledge locked away in Latin and handing it directly to everyday people in their native tongue. Right in the middle of the absolute chaos of war, Alfred empowered his kingdom with the written word.
Finally, Part 5, an enduring literary legacy.
When you look at the timeline, consider the profound collective impact of these 4 remarkable individuals: a cowherd, a mysterious poet, a devoted monk, and a warrior king. They're all seamlessly connected across the Old English period. In the 7th century, Cædmon introduces religious poetry. In 731, Bede preserves a nation's history. Across the 8th and 9th centuries, Cynewulf refines the artistry, and then in the 9th century, King Alfred champions translation. Though their lives were totally different, they were bound by a unified purpose, and together they laid an indestructible foundation.
I really want to leave you with this powerful thought. Civilizations are remembered not only by their victories, but by the knowledge they preserve. It really forces us to stop and reflect on what happens to a culture when preservation fails. Thanks to these four architects, England's earliest literature actually survived the darkness to inspire countless generations.
But, history never stands still, does it? This hard-won literary legacy, carefully built over centuries, is about to face its ultimate test. How will the impending Norman conquest of 1066 alter everything these men worked so hard to save? It is a fascinating shift that completely reshaped the English language as we know it. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. I hope you're as eager as I am to explore that exact question next time.
Welcome to this explainer on the incredible, enduring legacy of Old English literature. Today, we're diving into a seriously wild story of survival. We're going to uncover how the ancient language of Anglo-Saxon monks and warriors didn't just barely survive a totally society-altering conquest, it actually adapted, evolved, and literally laid the very foundation for the English you and I are speaking right now. When you think about great historical civilizations, they usually leave behind these massive stone monuments or crazy mechanical inventions. But the Anglo-Saxons, they left us something entirely different, though honestly, it's just as monumental. They left this deeply enduring cultural heritage and a literary tradition that successfully withstood centuries of brutal wars, catastrophic fires, and just the relentless passage of time. So that brings us to a really fascinating, massive what if. What actually happens to a language when its entire world gets conquered? I mean, usually an existential threat like that just straight up erases a culture from history. But instead of being destroyed, the earliest voices of the English people adapted. They transformed to survive. To really understand this, we have to look at 1066. This number is an absolute brutal turning point in history. In October of that year, William, Duke of Normandy, notoriously defeated King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings. And by seizing the throne, William didn't just swap out the leadership, he spearheaded a Norman conquest that fundamentally transformed society from the ground up. And it created an immediate existential crisis for the native language. As you can see in this graphic, breaking down the new social order, a super strict linguistic hierarchy took over basically overnight. French instantly became the language of the ruling class. It was the exclusive tongue of the royal court, government, and the law. Meanwhile, Latin securely held its ground as the undisputed language of the church and high scholarship. So suddenly, Old English, which had been the dominant voice of the land, was completely locked out of the halls of power. But here is where the story gets truly amazing. Old English didn't just pack up and vanish. It quietly and remarkably adapted. As we outline here, over generations, its incredibly complex grammatical endings were just stripped away. And to compensate for that loss, a strict word order became absolutely crucial to convey meaning. All the while, the language was just acting like a sponge, absorbing thousands of French and Latin words, enriching its vocabulary, and completely setting the stage for what would become Middle English. And this image right here beautifully illustrates the linguistic bridge that you and I cross every single day without even realizing it. Check out this contrast. Advanced concepts like government, high fashion, art, and science, those came straight from the Norman conquerors. But our most foundational everyday words, the gritty words for basic survival and family like mother, father, house, water, bread, and night, those come straight from Old English. The ruling language changed, for sure, but that daily, conversational foundation completely endured. Now, this brings us to a pretty vital question. Why does this 1,000-year-old literature still matter to us today? Why are everyday readers and university scholars alike still totally obsessed with poring over these ancient texts? Well, it isn't just to keep a historical record. It's actually because of the profound, totally recognizable humanity that they contain. The answer really boils down to the profoundly human themes we're looking at here. These works explore huge, timeless ideals like courage in the face of absolute danger and that unbreakable loyalty between leaders and followers. They dive into the devastating pain of exile and loss, alongside some really deep questions about faith, mortality, and our search for meaning. These are deeply human experiences that are honestly just as relevant to us today as they were back in an Anglo-Saxon mead hall. And the crazy thing is, we only have these stories thanks to the quiet, diligent preservation by monks in peaceful monasteries. Because they took the time to write them down, masterpieces like the legendary Beowulf, alongside works like The Wanderer, The Seafarer, and The Dream of the Rood, survived to establish this highly influential poetic tradition. By using powerful alliteration and vivid, sweeping imagery, these texts remain enduring works of art that speak clearly to us across centuries.
When you step back and look at this timeline mapping out the grand, sweeping journey of English literature, you can see exactly how that critical Anglo-Saxon foundation enabled literally everything that followed. From the Old English age, the story flows right into the Middle English period with legendary writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, erupts into the Renaissance with William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, and just continues expanding right into the modern English we speak today. So as we close out this grand chapter on the Old English era, we're literally opening the door to the next massive phase, the Middle English period. This is a super fascinating era where a rapidly changing language, completely fused with the cultural shock of the Norman conquest and pushed by some highly innovative writers, goes on to shape the entire future of literature. The story absolutely doesn't end here. It just transforms. Every great story has a beginning, and the story of English literature began right here, built entirely on the immense courage of anonymous poets and the quiet wisdom of early scholars. So, I'm going to leave you with this thought to chew on. The next time you use a simple everyday word like water or friend, ask yourself, what other ancient thousand-year-old echoes are hiding in your daily conversations? Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and we really hope you're eager to discover the incredible chapters that follow.